welcome everybody. It's lovely to see everybody here at the Wonder House. Woo! My name's Liesl, folks, and I have the great honor of serving as provost at the University of Arizona. And I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Todd Vanderah. Todd is the director of the Arizona Comprehensive Pain and Addiction Center. He's also a professor and chair of pharmacology, a joint professor in the departments of neurology and anesthesiology, all at the University of Arizona's College of Medicine. Todd does amazing, amazing research into the mechanisms of cancer pain, opioid use disorders, cannabinoid pharmacology, and neuronal integration in pain pathways in particular. He also makes amazing efforts to reach out to the community to educate people on substance abuse disorders and chronic pain. He was recently appointed to the Human Health and Services Agency as a member of the Pain Research Coordinating Committee at the National Institutes of Health. And we're really excited at the University of Arizona to have a seat at that table to do work that will impact the entire nation. So Todd's going to give us a talk today about cannabis. His title is Cannabis is Here, so let's understand it. And in particular, he wants to explain to us that currently it's easier for a researcher to study cocaine or morphine than it is to study CBD. And that fact is really limiting our ability to learn quickly how we can use these important chemicals to manage pain in our lives. So without any further ado, I want to welcome to the stage Dr. Todd Vanderah. Come on out, Todd.
All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. I'm so excited to be here to talk about one of my favorite topics, cannabis, here at South by. So why talk about cannabis? Well, if I asked everybody here in the room, do you have an opinion or perceptions about cannabis? Of course, every single person would say, yeah, I have some opinion about cannabis or some perception of cannabis. What I hope to do in the next 20 to 30 minutes is, first of all, give you something that might be new about cannabis that you may not know, but more importantly is hopefully by the end change your perception on what we know actually about cannabis. So right now we know that there are over 48 million Americans that actually have admitted, or at least in a survey, said that they actually use some type of cannabis product. Now, again, we think that this is quite a few Americans in the fact that this is 18% of Americans. So if I give you sort of what does that look like, it's actually the whole population of a state of California and Texas combined. So there's a lot of people that are actually using cannabis. And in the last year, there was over a 43% increase in the use of cannabis. And if we think that if that increase continues on in the next several years, that by 2030, it's predicted that there will be over 70 to 100 million Americans actually using cannabis. This is one in four Americans actually using cannabis. Now, if we compare that to some other substances like alcohol or tobacco, you'll see that alcohol has about 140 million Americans. That's about 1 out of every 3 Americans use alcohol. Tobacco, which happens to be on the decrease, is at about 46 million. So cannabis today is actually more often used than tobacco. Now, when we look at the users, and again, it's always hard to sort of figure out exactly how many people are using cannabis, but how can you really detect whether people are using cannabis? Well, the best way to look at it is sales, right? So if we look at the sales of cannabis in 2022, you can see that $17 to $20 billion were made in that year on sales of just cannabis. And what's nice is that we can compare it to things like something we all love, NFL football maybe, $12 billion. So cannabis is actually making more money than something like NFL football. We can look at it at the global opiate market, $26 billion. So again, cannabis is approaching the global use and sales of opiates. Craft beer at $27 billion. But really the statistic to look at is that within the next 3 years, it's predicted that cannabis sales will be at $52 billion. So it's really something that's taking over the market. And if you look at the global economic impact, you get numbers that look something like this, and the fact that it's last in 2022 is thought to be about $99 billion as far as the whole total economic impact within the United States. Again, in 3 years, we're looking at $158 billion within this particular market. So, is it something that we need to be more aware of? Absolutely. And so, hence, we can look at the idea that how does cannabis really work, right? And I think the idea is to sort of say, what do we know about cannabis? We know that there are 2 different types of cannabis receptors. Now, again, there's lots of things in the literature that suggest there are other types of receptors that are out there. But I can say that we know for a fact that there are 2 types of cannabinoid receptors. There's the CB1 and CB2 receptors. Now, when you look at these receptors, we know that they are all throughout the human body. And as a researcher, for many years, I've always asked this question. Why do we have cannabinoid receptors? Is it just for some day when I'm going through maybe high school or college and I smoke a joint and try a little bit? I don't think so. The fact that we have these receptors is the idea that they're actually doing something homeostatically. In other words, they're controlling things within our body, in the CNS as well as in the body itself. And so you'll see that we have quite a few different CB1 cannabinoid receptors. Now you'll notice that I've also put in the fact that these are the receptors that when activated by some cannabinoids can produce psychotropic effects, or the getting the high. But not all cannabinoids that act at CB1 will produce psychotropic effects. So that's the first thing to keep in mind. The second thing, if you notice when you look at this figure, that there are a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the human brain. The actual size of that blue dot there is representing that there's a lot of cannabinoid receptors in the human brain. As a matter of fact, it is thought to be the most abundant G-protein coupled receptor in the human brain. So it's got to be doing something. We just don't know much about what it's doing. But you can see it's all throughout the body as well. And then there's this other receptor, the CB2 receptor, which, again, when things act at it, are what we think of as non-psychotropic. So it doesn't produce the getting high. Again, you'll still see that it is in the brain, as well as in many of the different organs that are in the body that are regulating the immune system. So we have these cannabinoid receptors, and we're just beginning to sort of figure out what are they doing endogenously. They're not just there waiting for some day to become in contact with something like cannabis. Now, when we look at cannabis, or a marijuana plant, the first thing I want you to realize is that there's over 500 different chemical constituents or compounds inside this plant. And yet, most of what you'll ever read and research is always based off of one compound. And it's usually this guy here, is tetrahydrocannabinol, THC. It's often what's put in many of the different edibles, but it's also the thing that most of the research is done on. But what I want you to hopefully walk away with is the fact that we don't know much about many of the other chemicals that are actually in marijuana. So there's a few studies that have looked at CBD and maybe a little bit of CBN, but I want you to notice that there's over 100 different types of cannabinoids that are actually in a medical marijuana plant. Of course, there's terpenes too, and terpenes are the ones that give that plant that smell, that characteristic smell. And there's a whole family of different terpenes. Many of the plants that we use, both for medicinal purposes as well as even edibles, have terpenes in there that may be actually beneficial. And so we don't know what the benefit of these other cannabinoids and terpenes are, and what makes it even more complicated is we don't know how they interact with each other. So I hope to show you how that happens here in a few slides. Okay, so we can think about cannabis and cannabinoids coming from medical marijuana, but did you know that your own body actually makes a cannabinoid? Of course it does, because again, like I said, the receptors are not there just so that at some point you might actually have some cannabis, right? They're there, and your body's actually making its own cannabinoid. We call this an endogenous cannabinoid. So the human body actually makes this, and most cells in the human body will actually make its own cannabinoid. Again, we call these the endogenous cannabinoids. It actually comes out of the lipid membrane of cells, and every cell that we tend to look in actually can make those cannabinoids. And so we think of it as coming from lipids, in which these lipids will actually get converted over, if it has these enzymes, into what's called 2-AG, 2-arachidonylglycerol. We call it 2-AG. Nobody wants to say that name. So 2-AG is there, and it actually can act at the cannabinoid receptors. Now, this is what's interesting, is that when it acts at the cannabinoid receptors, you don't see psychotropic effects. You don't see that getting high kind of effect. So there's something about the 2-AG, the endogenous cannabinoid, that doesn't produce a psychotropic effect, unlike something like THC. Now, most of these cannabinoids, as 2-AG, will get broken down. So we know that cells are really good at clearing out the system, so it will break down the 2-AG. And it does this, and it actually forms prostaglandins. Now, isn't that interesting? Prostaglandins, we know, as something that produces pain and inflammation. Matter of fact, most of the medications that you've used, things like aspirin or ibuprofen, actually block this enzyme and inhibit prostaglandin. But get this, you have a system in which you're making something like 2-AG. This actually inhibits pain and inflammation, but the product breakdown will actually produce something like prostaglandin that can produce pain and inflammation. And so, of course, where pharma's going in this particular area happens to be blocking these enzymes. There's a lot of new medications that are now going into clinical trials in order to say, can we increase one's own endogenous cannabinoids? And so if you do that, you can see in the model, you lose the prostaglandins and you increase the arachidonic acid, suggesting the fact that now you're going to modulate one's own cannabinoids. Even more interesting on this particular system is that we're starting to realize that some diseases and disorders may be related to the levels that you produce. Not everybody produces the same. I'll show you some evidence in the fact that some people with migraine have very low levels of 2-AG. They've actually measured this directly out of the blood, and people with migraine actually have low levels. And the idea here is to think, can we increase this for people with migraine? So, are there different diseases and disorders that may have different levels of your own endogenous cannabinoid? Yes, I do believe so. So, what can these medications be used for? Well, as I said, they'll begin to use them for things like pain and inflammation. But if you look into clinical trials, you'll see they'll be used for things like migraine. They'll be used for things like cancer. They'll be used for things like epilepsy, even things like traumatic brain injury, obsessive compulsive disorder, multiple sclerosis, and even dementia. Yes, so all of these types of things are actually being studied in looking at the endogenous cannabinoid system and or other non-psychotropic cannabinoids. Now, the next natural question is to say, well, how do we change our own endogenous cannabinoids? Well, just like you've probably heard about endorphins, right? And we know the fact that if you go out running, you can actually change your level of endorphin. So far, we know that endogenous cannabinoids can actually go up due to exercise. They also go up due to stress, possibly due to diet. So there's many things that we're starting to actually realize that you can change your own endogenous cannabinoids based on some of these different things. Now, some of the research that I've done is looking at either the endogenous cannabinoid system or looking at something like non-psychotropic cannabinoids. And again, this is sort of getting away from THC. There's a lot of literature on THC, but I want to know what else is in a plant, like a marijuana plant, that might be helpful. And so a lot of the work I've done has actually been looking at it in metastatic cancer. In metastatic cancer, especially in things like prostate, lung, breast cancer, it goes off to the bone and it becomes very, very painful and inflammatory. And basically, those types of patients, they really have only one thing that we give them, and that's opiates, unfortunately. And we know there's all kinds of problems with opiates. And so I've started studying this, and to make years of studies quickly in one slide, I've actually been able to show that these cannabinoids, again, non-psychotropic cannabinoids, can actually decrease bone loss. And so you can see sort of a normal femur, what would look like here, but then you can see that in metastatic cancer, you can see there's degradation of the bone, you can see fractures after some period of time. And the point is you can definitely see that the bone has less scarring and less fracturing just by using non-psychotropic cannabinoids. What's also interesting is that the patients that we did these studies actually showed that they had much less pain from metastatic cancer due to these non-psychotropic cannabinoids, as well as slowing the tumor. So you can see that it's not a chemotherapeutic, but it actually slowed down the actual growth of, in this case, metastatic breast cancer in the actual femur itself, suggesting the fact that there's a lot of new things that are coming out about other types of cannabinoids that might be helpful. As I mentioned, there's also been this syndrome, more or less called now, called clinical endocannabinoid deficiency. And again, this is directly from studies in which they've taken blood from patients with migraine, and they've actually showed that they have significantly lower levels of endogenous cannabinoid. Again, suggesting the fact that either migraine causes the decrease, or the fact that they have migraines is because they have a decrease in the production of that 2A gene. Again, it's still work that's being done. Now, the last part of many of the studies that I've done is trying to be responsible about not putting another medication out there like the opiates that may be addictive. So what we've done is we've looked at a number of different cannabinoids, and I can tell you that we have shown that they do not actually have the potential to produce addiction. What does that mean? Well, addiction is a very complicated thing. But what we've looked at is to see, do these cannabinoids produce a rewarding or euphoric behavior? And no, unlike THC, they do not. Even more impressively, if you look into, right now, clinical trials by our government, you will see that there are cannabinoids, non-psychotropic cannabinoids, being actually used for people with opiate use disorder, for alcohol. They're putting it for tobacco. And get this, they're even using it for THC use disorder. So here they're using another cannabinoid to try to help prevent some of the THC effects, some of the opiate effects that produce rewarding. So again, hopefully our perceptions about something like marijuana or cannabinoids begin to change because we just don't know enough about the whole family of cannabinoids. I also love to make sure that I've always, in every single talk I ever do, make sure that they actually talk about the harm that can be done. And I say this with the fact that we've all seen commercials for any type of pharmaceutical thing on TV, whether it's blood pressure, diabetes, and you will see that long list of all the side effects. Sometimes the side effects sound worse than the actual disease that you're trying to take care of. But the point is that, of course, something like marijuana and cannabinoids are going to produce this, and so it's always important to say the fact that there's going to be some short-term problems, obviously, with certain types of cannabinoids. Now, most of this has actually been studied in THC specifically, but a lot of the other side effects of the other cannabinoids have not actually come out. And so it's really important to me to make sure that we understand that being responsible and doing responsible research at the university, we're going to say what it may do, as I showed you with cancer and migraine, but we're also very interested in to say what other types of side effects might some of these things produce. And so far, we know some of the non-psychotropic cannabinoids do not produce any of the cognition impairment or motor impairment. Now, with that, I'd like to talk about the responsibility in the products of cannabis. And again, edibles are one of those things which, of course, these look delicious. What a cool scene, right? But the problem is that just this last year, in the pediatric world, they put out a report with over 3,000 reports of toxicity in children under 6 years old. And so, again, it comes back to the point that these things are loaded with THC, and unfortunately, they look like candy, and kids are getting their hands on them. So I always want to think about the fact that we should also be responsible about how we market something like this, or making it so that kids do not have access to something like this. In 4 years, there's been over 1,300% increase in toxicity due to edibles. And so we do have to make sure that we're responsible. I can tell you that in the paper that they just published, the only benefit is that not one child died. There were some serious side effects, but at least there was no deaths. So the last I want to sort of talk about is the idea that we need to figure out how to do better studies with the combination of cannabinoids. What does that mean? Again, a lot of the work you've seen so far has been about THC. And I can tell you that this was a fantastic study that actually looked at brain function. Now, these are volunteers, and what they did was they had 3 different groups or times of treatment. The first group would get THC, and they would do that for, I think, 2-week period, and then they would do images of the brain. Of course, they did images before they started, and they did images of the brain, and what they showed was that, in general, THC would sort of decrease that sort of basal function. We all have a basal function of the brain that's called the default mode network. And some people think it makes decision-making. I don't know. The point is that it just kind of did decrease that. It sort of tones it down. And that makes sense. Remember, I told you the CB1 receptors are one of the highest receptors in the human brain. Then they did it with CBD and some other types of CBG or terpenes, and they didn't see that effect. So really, it was unique to THC. But what I loved about this study is then they did the combination. And what they found is that when they combined the CBDs and CBN and CBLs, the other cannabinoids, with THC, they lost the effect. In other words, it actually inhibited the decrease in brain activity, suggesting the fact that what about combinations? Can we make a better medical marijuana, or just a marijuana in general? Can we make something that's healthy as far as less side effects, and can we make something that's more medicinally useful? So I believe that we can. The question is how do we get there, right? So let me share with you, just in the last few slides, the fact that it's very, very difficult to do research in this particular area. And I wanted to kind of just show you the fact of how many publications have come out on things like alcohol versus tobacco versus opiates. And yeah, way down here at the bottom, the number of publications on cannabis. Only 30,000 as compared to over 1 million on alcohol. So this is reality today. These are peer-reviewed publications on research. So do we know much about cannabis? Well, there's your answer. And you think 30,000 is quite a bit, but as you can see, we still have issues with alcohol and obviously with opiates. So there's no doubt that there's a lack of research out there for things like cannabis. And it correlates directly to this side, which is the money. Most of the research is funded by the federal government. And so you can kind of look at the actual federal government funds, and you can see that there's a huge amount of money for opiates. And again, this is just based on the last 5 years because of the opiate epidemic. But you can see $1.7 billion the federal government now has put out for research on opiates. $600 million for alcohol and tobacco, but you can see only $200 million for cannabis. And what's interesting is most of that money has come out in the last few years. You know why? The opiate epidemic. The government panicked and said, oh my gosh, what are we going to do with this opiate? Oh, well, maybe we can put more money towards research in cannabis. So the idea that cannabis research is really only a small percentage, 3% compared to alcohol. And the fact that the cannabis research is only 11% of opiate research really tells you that we just don't know much about cannabis. And even though often when I'm around different groups or people say they know everything about cannabis, I think hopefully you'll walk away today thinking maybe we don't know as much as we think we do. Why do we have such limited research? Well, I'm going to write my list up here. You could probably give me another list. But one of the first things is that it's scheduled, right? Schedule I drug, which means that people like myself who do research in this area have to have a special license. I have to have a DA officer, and I have to do a lot of different controlled things within the lab to be able to do research with a Scheduled I drug. But there are multiple other things that come into play of why we don't have the funding and therefore the research for cannabis. Again, a lot of them have to do with the fact of politics, right? Politicians set budgets, and so politicians are going to be swayed by their constituents who have perceptions about cannabis. They have stigma, right? So it's involved. And stigma. Researchers like myself actually are stigmatized. There's many other researchers that don't think we should be studying cannabis. Now, I don't know if that's because they're fighting for those dollars, but the point is that even a researcher like myself can be stigmatized based off the amount of research that I do by other researchers. And so there's definitely issues in which this all comes. And I think when you look at cannabis, you can start to understand that what I do research on, and that's what I say my studies here, is very, very different, as I have to use what the government gives me or allows me to use. Whereas what's on the market, I am sure, as you guys would tell me, is very different than what I'm studying, which is very unfortunate, but the government, because it is federally regulated, and I have to actually use what they allow me to, and I can't use what's actually on the market today. Finally, medicinal efficacy. Again, if I asked all of you in the room, some of you would say, oh, I've tried this stuff, it doesn't work at all. And then there's some other people that I've met who'll say, it works for everything. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle, but the point is that when you have people that have beliefs of this, it also starts to sort of sway how people want to maybe push research forward or have funding for something like cannabis. So today I challenge us all to be able to say, can we make a better medical marijuana? You know, can we improve cannabis? But most importantly is, I hope today that I've been able to sort of change, hopefully, your perceptions and your opinions about cannabis, and finally make you realize that we really don't know near as much as we think we do, and hence we need more research in this area. Thank you. I think we have time for some questions. Yeah, there's some hands up, and I think there's some microphones.
Thank you. Thank you for doing the talk. First of all, we're here talking about cannabis research, so I think it's important to say rest in peace to Dr. Machulam, who just passed away a few days ago, who was credited with the discovery of the endocannabinoid system. My question, though, is two parts. One, what has changed since 2014, since Dr. Sisley's study was approved for looking into PTSD and when she was subsequently fired immediately by the Board of Regents? And unrelated to that, are you doing any research into some of the anecdotal evidence that cannabis can help with the treatment of ADHD?
Yeah, I'll start with the first part there. There's not a lot I can do about what's happened with Sue Sisley. Of course, it enters right into the word politics, as you saw on my slide. There's a big, big political issue when you're dealing with trying to do research in cannabis, and Sue Sisley, a dear friend of mine and a physician there up in Phoenix, yes, has obviously faced this problem with trying to do studies, whether it's in PTSD or anything. So there's no doubt there's been a lot of issues with that. The second part of the question was exactly what? Oh, in ADHD. Yes. So there's been quite a few studies looking at cannabis in ADHD, PTSD, and so where does it stand? Again, the problem is that most of the studies tend to focus on THC, and specifically on one. Now, getting anything approved through the FDA when it's a combination is very, very difficult. It's very time-consuming, and it's very costly. So most people will do studies on one type of chemical compound, or hence trying to use marijuana. And it's been very, very difficult to sort of say, is it going to be helpful for ADHD or PTSD? I believe there is. I think it's finding out what is the right combination of THC with some of the other types of cannabinoids and or terpenes. And doing that has got to be one of the most difficult things as far as getting through the FDA. Quickly, the way you do that is that you have to do every single thing separate and then in combinations through all of the studies, including all the tox studies. So it's a very, very difficult task. Thanks for the question. Yep.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I just have one quick question. Could you talk a bit about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome? And
hyperemesis?
Yeah, hyperemesis.
Yes.
Yes.
This is something that no doubt is there. So it's been very prevalent, especially lately it's been showing up. Chronic use, and I'm almost positive it's linked to THC now, but the chronic use of THC. Now, it's very unique. I'm going to back up for a second because we actually have one cannabinoid or two cannabinoids that are approved by the FDA, and guess what it's approved for? Emesis. It's actually approved for chemotherapeutic-induced emesis at a lower dose. And the problem is that chronic use of higher doses can actually result in hyperemesis, and we're seeing that. It's a problem not only with people who obviously are having the hyperemesis, but it's even a problem of patients showing up in the OR, in which, again, that's something that many people won't actually put on a piece of paper when they're going to see the doctor before, like, what medications are you taking? They often leave out that THC part, but then all of a sudden, some of the other chemicals that are used to put somebody under actually can start to evoke the hyperemesis. And it's been seen in patients with THC, or people taking THC. Question?
You mentioned that you have to use the cannabis that the government provides. I know it used to look like kind of moldy grass clippings. Has it gotten any better? Or do you have any better product that you're able to research with these days than you used to be?
Well, we do get better products, and we have, fortunately, there are growers now that are being approved by government, right? So that we can actually use that product. So there's no doubt it's getting better. I'm continually addressing the government and the fact that I'd like to be able to use other things that are even in my own market in Arizona, but it's getting better. Question?
Has there been any research done on cannabis and driving? I mean, more and more states are legalizing it, and one of the dilemmas is...
I had trouble seeing cannabis in what?
Driving.
In driving.
Yeah, driving while
yeah.
high.
Well, there's no doubt that cannabis and driving will be very similar to the alcohol in driving. Is there more research being done on it? Is that what you're saying? Right. There has been a number of studies. So when you go to the actual meetings, obviously, and I was at a meeting up in the government in Scottsdale where they're actually doing some more testing. It's very similar to DUI to sort of find out what is that concentration of THC where it might impair you. And there's no doubt that at a certain level or percentage that you can get some response impairment, probably very similar to DUI, to alcohol.
Thanks for the talk. If endogenous cannabinoids are not psychotropic, why do we have so many of them in our brain?
Yes, so I'll say they lack psychotropic effects. I won't say they won't be at all because I haven't done a study enough to get the levels up high enough to actually see psychotropic effects, right? So this is where it gets real difficult. I've used things that block the enzymes. They'll go up and I can measure it, but I haven't seen psychotropic yet. So I don't know if there's something else that I can do to get it higher. But why don't they is a great question in the fact of our responsibility is starting to say, can we make something, a cannabinoid, that can act at the receptors but don't produce that? In other words, I want to know why 2AG doesn't do that, right? Because then we could actually sort of balance out the amount of psychotropic effect versus non-psychotropic effect. But we don't know the reason for that yet. There's a lot of bias signaling and how receptors interact with different compounds that will produce different outcomes. All right. Well, thank you very much. Oh, one more question?
I don't think it's, oh, it is on. Thanks for your talk.
Sure.
This is actually coming from my business partner, so I have to read it. I do know some of this, but research in minor cannabinoids, specifically, I'm going to call them Farm Bill loophole products that are available on bodegas and gas stations throughout the United States, Delta 8, THCP, CBDP, and on top of that, what's your bet that they just completely roll all this back and start rating these places east to west because the products are psychoactive and legal?
Was the first part of that question about
the minor
minors,
cannabinoids?
right?
If you've researched them, and to what extent?
I have not. I have not done any research in minors. As you know, it's very difficult for us to do that. So I can say that I've done research in chronic use in mice that were neonates, but of course not in minors as far as humans. Is that what you're asking about, children? Minors, studies in minors?
Well, minor cannabinoids, but maybe in children as well. Let's get that one out of the way.
So I've done a number of different studies in which I've looked at things like THC or other cannabinoids chronically in neonate mice. And again, we don't see a lot of cognitive impairment. But again, that's a totally different thing than talking about children or humans. So.
The bet on the Farm Bill loophole rollback.
I don't know much about the loopholes on the Farm Bill. So, Oh, another question.
Thanks. You mentioned that there's a minimum amount of funding for cannabis, and I'm wondering if it's possible and legal to sidestep the federal government funding and go to like some kind of private entity like crowdfunding, like Indiegogo, that kind of, yeah.
There's definitely other sources of funding. States are providing funding now, so I was lucky enough to receive a grant from the state of Arizona when it became legal based off taxes. So there are other ways now that we are going to increase the research for based on funding coming from either states where it's been legalized, industry. So I've worked with a number of different industry partners in order to look at cannabis and cannabis use. So we are kind of bypassing that. But again, the majority of researchers get most of their funding from the federal government. And until the federal government changes their policy, I don't see it increasing as much as something like opiate research and alcohol research.
The NFL recently put out a grant and awarded it to, I think it was a university. I'm wondering what kind of research you're doing with, like, the NFL, the VA, the HHS people? Yes.
I'm not doing any research at all with the NFL. With the VA, we have quite interest in things like PTSD. We know that in post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as TBI, I've published a recent paper on traumatic brain injury. There's a lot of inflammation. And what's interesting is if you get the right combination of cannabinoids, you can actually decrease inflammation. And hence when I was showing you there, many of those things like multiple sclerosis, dementia, all of it seems to be related to inflammation. And there's no doubt that the right combination will significantly decrease the amount of inflammation. And that actually results in much better cognitive impairment or cognitive improvement after a TBI. or PTSD, but it also, especially in TBI, it actually seems to affect the pathology. And so you start to see that there's less tissue damage in the treatment. Now, again, this is a treatment that goes for 2 weeks. All right. Well, you guys have been great. Thank you very much.